We are fortunate this afternoon at this panel, War, Politics, and Ideas, to have with us three experts on foreign policy. And what is even more special, they each have a deep grounding in Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. And they bring that framework, that philosophical framework, to their understanding of foreign policy and of the world today. So let me introduce everybody this afternoon, and we'll get into the discussion. The plan is I will set up the topics, and then we invite you to bring your questions to the panel. We'll have a mic here, and we'll try to get through as many questions as we can in the time we have. We're really excited to hear your thoughts. So let me begin with Yaron Brook, well known to many of you, but for those who do not know, Yaron Brook is chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute's board. He is also has co-written books with Don Watkins on political issues and economic issues, but I'm very proud to say that Yaron contributed to a book I worked on, Winning the Unwinnable War, and he also contributed a chapter on neoconservatism in a book that Brad Thompson wrote, so Yaron has a lot of expertise in this area. Peter Schwartz, former chairman of the board of the Ayn Rand Institute, his books include The Tyranny of Need, which the new version of which, published under that name, includes a chapter on foreign policy.
Two chapters.
Two chapters on foreign policy, pardon me. And prior to that, you wrote the book, Foreign Policy of Self-Interest, The Moral Ideal for America, which I have read numerous times, and I've learned a lot from that, so I appreciate that. And next to me is Dr. Scott McDonald. Congratulations on defending your dissertation.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's probably not news to many of you here, but I'm proud to be able to say that Scott's a friend, and I really respect his scholarship. So Scott has co-edited two books that are related to China policy and analysis. That's Scott's area of expertise. He also has a background, which you can describe more accurately than I can, in diplomatic work and through the military. So welcome, glad to have you. And we'll yeah, please, round of applause.
Much better.
I know,
Like
that's
night and
the
day.
advisors.
Night and day.
So let's get started. What I'd like to do is start with a sweep of some of the big issues that are out there. And what I'm going to do is, I know, where do we begin? What I'd like to do is ask each of you one or two questions to set up these issues, get your perspective on the fundamental, as you understand it, what's the critical thing to think about, and then we'll weave some of these topics together because I think they interact. And for everyone here, I'll tell you what my goal is from this conversation. I think there's a lot of detail, a lot of knowledge that is needed to process these issues. So we're going to talk about Ukraine and Russia, we're going to talk about Gaza, we're going to talk about the Middle East generally and China, so that there's a wide panorama here. One of the things I'm hoping will come out in the conversation is how each of you process these issues from a perspective that is informed by a rational philosophy. So I'm going to prompt you as much as I can to bring out and make explicit the ways in which your approach is distinctive to these issues. So I think that's a really important takeaway from tonight. So I think of objectivism as a tool for understanding these issues much better than most people can. All right, so why don't we start with you, Yaron. Let's talk about Ukraine, Russia. That's a war that's now in its almost third year coming up, 2.5 years. I'm interested in your reflections on that. Last summer at OCON, the Objectivist conference, you spoke about the reactions to Ukraine and the takeaways from that. So where's your thinking on that? What are the crucial issues to understand in that conflict? What do you think where is it heading?
Well, I think that the main thing to understand in terms of the conflict is the nature of the combatants, that is, the countries involved. I think the most important thing is to understand the nature of Putin, understand the nature of Putin's Russia, and what they aspire to, what their goals are, how evil they really are, and how ideological they are. That is, I think a lot of people view the conflict in between Ukraine and Russia as in terms of, well, Russia was worried about NATO, or after the oil fields, the significant gas fields in southern Ukraine. Kind of a materialistic, a lot of time kind of a materialistic explanation. And I think there's a real undervaluing of the nature of the Russian regime and its imperialistic ambitions and its need for war in order to survive because of the nature of the type of authoritarianism there. And I don't see much of that being discussed even today. So I don't see a lot that has really changed from that perspective. And I think that the second issue is, what does it mean for Russia to win for America, right? What is our rational self-interest here? What is the West's self-interest? And I think there's very little understanding of that. There's very little understanding of the consequence of defeat for Ukraine, for NATO, and for the United States. And as a consequence, while NATO and the United States keep supporting Ukraine, they do it in a weak, they'll allow a certain weapon 3 months from now with 5 conditions, and you can only use this size bullets and not those size bullets. And they do everything they can to on the one hand, pretend they're helping Ukraine, on the other hand, to constrain them and tie their hands. It's this expression of kind of an altruistic war where they're constantly torn by some sense of self-interest. But no, we can't do too much of that. That would be immoral and wrong. And certainly the Biden administration has been very guilty of sometimes saying very good things about how bad Russia is and supporting Ukraine, but then not living up to it, or living up to it in such a half-hearted way that by some measures it's more harmful than it is helpful.
So you mentioned what's in America's self-interest, and I want to bring you in on that topic, Peter. This is something you've written a lot about. Maybe you can help set the stage for how do you think of that America's self-interest? And the one thing I've noticed in studying this area is that practically everyone talks about America's self-interest, but they don't seem to have the same conception of it. And I would like to hear from you, how do you think of it? How do you differentiate it from the perspective that is out there in the sort of establishment view?
Well, I'd say more than the question of how they understand our self-interest is the question of, do they think we have a moral right to pursue our self-interest? I think that is the crucial underlying problem with our whole foreign policy, because nothing else could explain why for the past 75 years America consistently is unable to emerge victorious from a military conflict. It obviously isn't because the other side is militarily stronger. America is the strongest country in the world, militarily, potentially militarily. Yet we're constantly defeated by these little 2-bit countries. And the reason is because morality ultimately shapes a country's direction, including its foreign policy. The dominant thinking in this country and in the world is that the pursuit of your self-interest is tainted, just as it is for the individual. It's immoral to be selfish. You can't pursue your own interests. You have to sacrifice for others. The same applies to foreign policy. It's considered morally tainted to do whatever is necessary to pursue your interest, for America to pursue its interest, because that's selfish. You have to sacrifice. You have to give up your interest because you have to consider the interests of other countries in the world. You don't want to be too self-assertive. You want to come to some compromise. You want to have some middle ground. So that, I think, is the fundamental, and that then leads to a different conception of what self-interest is. I wouldn't say it leads to, but it combines with a different conception of what self-interest is, because, in fact, there is only one thing that is in America's interest, foreign policy, the country's interest, and that is to protect the liberty of its citizens. Nothing else. Everything else is simply a means to that. And if that were clearly defined, then we would be able to say, okay, our self-interest consists in destroying Islamic totalitarianism. It consists in invading Afghanistan and annihilating the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and installing a government that will no longer be a threat to the freedom of American citizens. And then you figure out, well, what are the means of doing it? Once you define the end, you can establish the means, but you can't define the end if you're not convinced that it's morally proper. And the problem is that people think it is not morally proper.
Let me come back to you, Yaron, because I want to challenge something you said. Maybe it'll help bring out a point that I heard in your comments, which is, so you emphasized the moral character of the two sides and sort of the character of Putin's regime. How do you respond to the view that, well, how is he actually ideological? He doesn't seem ideological. You characterize him as imperialistic. He doesn't resemble other imperialistic movements or leaders. So how do you think of what's motivating Putin, for example, and how do you process that?
Well, first of all, you can judge that by his actions, but in terms of getting to his underlying motivation, you read him. You know, he tells you exactly why he's doing it. He's not hiding any of it. You know, you can go to the Kremlin's website, and on the Kremlin's website, Putin's speeches, some of his speeches, and he's written an article on Ukraine. He wrote it about 7-8 months before the war, about how he views Ukraine and what the meaning of Ukraine is to him, and so on. And you look at his actions vis-a-vis what he's writing, and they're consistent. He views Ukraine as part of some mystical entity that he conceives of as Russia. Ukrainians are just Russians, and it's somehow being corrupted. And the goal is to unify them. And I think the other thing you do is you look at the people influencing him. You look at the thinkers, the philosophers, the public intellectuals in Russia, and you look at what are their ideas, what are the ideas that dominate. And Putin himself talks about religion quite a bit, but then you look at the people around him and their religiosity. But then, you know, if you read Dugin or if you read some of the other people who are heavily influencing Putin, you can see their ambitions go beyond Ukraine. They really view some kind of mystical destiny for Russia on a global scale. They literally talk about dominating all of Europe and going all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, which means all the way to the Iberian Peninsula. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, right? But they really believe this. I mean, all the megalomaniacs sound ridiculous, but they truly believe it and they act on it. And you know, we have a hard time conceiving of evil, and we have a hard time conceiving of that kind of evil. And as a consequence, nobody takes them seriously. But they tell you exactly what they're going to do. Hitler told us exactly what he was going to do. The communists didn't hide what their ambitions were, and certainly not their global ambitions from a foreign policy perspective. And, you know, Putin is not hiding what he intends to do and what he wants to do. The question is, can we take it seriously, and then can we stand up to him? And there you bump up against exactly what Peter just said. Standing up to him means defending ourselves and acting in our self-interest, and you know, believing that acting in your self-interest is justified. And you just don't see. Even when they do that, they have to do it in a half-hearted way because they can't actually stand up and say, no, we need, you know, we are better than him, and we stand for proper values, and we are going to defend ourselves and do what it takes.
So I hope you guys are stimulated to ask questions. We'll turn to that in about 10, 15 minutes. I want to get some other topics on the table and come to you, Peter. So I think it was last month we published your essay in New Ideal, the Journal of the Ayn Rand Institute, on the sympathizers of Hamas. I want to come to that, but maybe we should go a little wider first, just to get your read of the Hamas-Israel conflict. Just in a capsule, how you understand it, where you stand on that, and then maybe you can tell us a bit about your perspective in that article.
Well, it should be evident that the fundamental conflict is between a civilized country and a barbaric entity that wants to destroy wants to destroy Israel because it's a civilized country, because they regard the Jewish state as something that is a slap in their face. It stands as something that they want to destroy because they want to destroy the good. So the fundamental conflict is between an entity that is clearly outside the bounds of civilization, Hamas, an entity that politically is a dictatorship. The government of Gaza, as the governments in virtually all the countries in the Middle East besides Israel, is authoritarian or dictatorial or monarchic, as against Israel, which is a free country, which is a country where you're able to engage in free expression, you're able to criticize the government, you're able to practice any religion you want, including Islam, where the political parties are freely formed, and they have even pro-Arab political parties, and they have pro-Arab members of their parliament, the Knesset. All of this would get you arrested or shot in the rest of Gaza. So the two sides could not be clearer expressions of good and evil. The problem with the war there, as I wrote in that article, is that because of the philosophy, the ethics of altruism, people are sympathetic to Hamas. Now, leave aside the hardcore Hamas members themselves, people in the West, of whom you wouldn't think they would be sympathetic to brutal mass murderers, rapists, killers of babies, torturers, they are drawn to be sympathetic to Hamas because Hamas is the weaker party here. Hamas is being defeated by Israel. Hamas now has people who are hungry, who have their houses destroyed, have no place to go. Isn't that terrible? So Israel is being constantly reproached for failing to sacrifice for people in need. Israel is strong. Israel is the powerful nation. It's winning its battle militarily. Therefore, it must show mercy to its opponents. It must show charity and compassion towards them at the expense of its own interest. That is, Israel's survival requires clearly, unquestionably, the destruction of Hamas and the creation of a government in Gaza, in the whole of Palestine, which will no longer be a threat to Israel. That is what is required for its existence, for the safety of the people of Israel, which is the definition of Israel's self-interest, to protect the liberty of its citizens, and that means to protect it from attack by the Palestinians. And the only way to do that is militarily, to get rid of them. Yet that is being denied them. They're being prevented from doing that because of the imperatives of altruism. So it's ultimately a philosophic, moral battle here, much more than a military one.
I want to come back to that. I expect there'll be some questions about that. I have other topics. I want to bring you in now, Scott. So one of the interesting things that has come out since the invasion of Ukraine is, well, let me start with that. So at the time of the invasion, one of the concerns people had is, unless there's a strong response from the West to Russia, that will be a green light to China to go into Taiwan. That hasn't happened. One question is how to understand that. So that's one question I want to talk about. But let's maybe start wider and just understand. So tell us how you think of the Chinese regime, how you understand their approach to the world, and then we can maybe dig into that question about Taiwan as well.
Sure. Well, Xi Jinping has a vision, right? And frankly, it's a vision that has been shared throughout the history of the Communist Party. He is seeking the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And we can read that, we can repeat it, but we have to interrogate it for what that actually means. Because for Xi Jinping, rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is both historical and moral. It's reestablishing the greatness of China But the greatness of China is as a central nation that is deferred to, that is a leader, that sets the tone for the way things happen in its region, and its region is traditionally the world. That's moral because the philosophy that it's built on, the precepts and the principles of classical Chinese philosophy, dictate that society is rightfully organized as a hierarchy. And that hierarchy extends across the human family. And at the top sits the emperor. And it is moral that the leader in Beijing lead over society, the world family. And so he is seeking to reestablish that, his power, his influence, so that he can shape events. And it comes from this moral idea, it comes from memories of historical greatness and historical weakness, and he is actively trying to shape the world so that China is on top.
In nothing that you've said have I heard communism.
No, interestingly enough.
Say a bit more about that. So how do you think of the relationship of communism to the Communist Party of China, that is the ruling party? Well, how do you process that?
So the Communist Party was, of course, established back in 1921, as in a lot of places, a lot of eager young lads who had read some Marx or Lenin and said, hey, we need reform, we need to change things that are out there, here's something that might help us. And they went forth, and some were very doctrinaire, some were not so much. One of the not so much was Mao, right? Mao, who eventually seized control of the party, was a revolutionary, but was a classical Chinese patriot. He may have read part of the Communist Manifesto, and that was it. Not at all familiar with Marx's writings, with Marxist Leninism. But the Chinese Communist Party did take to heart very much the Leninist idea of the party as vanguard of the revolution. And so as Mao went forward, he was very focused on upholding his power and the party. But if you actually read his writings, you read what he was saying about world situation, communism is a lot less important than reestablishing China. And yes, we see some things like the Great Leap Forward where we instituted communes, but that was done for a purpose, right? As a way to control and to reinvigorate the nation in his mind. It wasn't necessarily that he thought communism was necessarily the way forward. Very quickly, he started talking about the truth of communism, the truth of socialism comes from our experience and our leadership, right? From the conditions of China. Deng became even more explicit. Socialism with Chinese characteristic is born out of the history of the party and the conditions of China. And now it's even more explicit. You do get the mouthing of Marxist slogans now and then, but Xi is just as likely to quote Confucius and Lao Tzu as he is Marx. And if you look at what they say in terms of justifying things and the way they act, it's about the classical Chinese philosophy and its support for the hierarchy as the only way that China can be ruled.
So I was at a conference, a one-day conference in Denver months ago, and one of the speakers ahead of me was someone who specializes in this area. He presented facts that were new to me, such as the scale of China's growing military, its capacity on the seas, and it wasn't a narrative he was pushing, but it fits with a wider narrative of China is growing militarily, it has ambitions to control, and so how do you think of that is it a threat? There is definitely many voices telling us that we should be worried about China as a military threat too. What's your take on that?
Well, the military does serve multiple purposes, and one is, if it should come to fighting a war, is to fight and win that war. It's also signaling, right? It's showing who is the top dog. It's intimidating. It's absolutely used coercively. It's also used domestically as a legitimizing factor. Look how great we are. There's a bit of Me Too-ism. The United States has a big military. We have to show that we do as well. I think they're absolutely preparing so that they can use the military if they have to. I think their preference is to achieve their aims without using the military. And you see that even when they're using coercive force in the South China Sea, it's always the Coast Guard. Because they want to, well, not always the Coast Guard, sometimes it's fishermen who work for the government, right? But it's the fishermen, if they need more firepower, it's the Coast Guard. The Navy may be over the horizon as protection, but they want to not do it militarily because they think that causes chaos. There's some other reasons. If the Coast Guard is pushing fishermen off of islands in the South China Sea, it's a law enforcement action protecting Chinese territory, right? So it gives an air of sovereignty enforcement rather than the military fighting the war.
So 2 quick things, and I know they're not quick to answer, but I'll just put them on the stage and we can explore them further if people are interested. So one is Taiwan, which I raised earlier.
Right.
The other one is Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong is, my understanding, is a tragedy. And
so.
Taiwan, is that what's going to happen with Taiwan? Is something similar going to... So maybe you can tell us your understanding of those two.
Yeah, and I'll try to come back to the initial question too. Sorry about that. So, of course, Hong Kong is a horrible tragedy, a foreseeable one, unfortunately.
Maybe just unpack that a bit for people. So I don't know how many people tracked what's happened in Hong Kong in the last few years.
So, well, let's go back a little further. And, of course, the one country, two systems formula under which the PRC reassumed sovereignty was this idea that Hong Kong would continue to be autonomous for a period of time. We normally say 50 years. PRC was also much more vague, much more often very vague. And then the PRC would be sovereign, handle foreign relations, but Hong Kong would be allowed to do what they want internally. What we've seen over the past decade is a much quicker clampdown. The PRC has wanted to apply an increasing number of laws, from whether extradition is allowed and how, to putting in laws on sedition when the Hong Kong legislature failed to do so, that have basically turned Hong Kong into just another part of the PRC. The autonomy is effectively gone. There were mass protests. They have been effectively quashed through a combination of thuggery and COVID enforcement. COVID came at a good time for them, and so that's basically gone. Interestingly enough, the one country, two systems formula was introduced as a way to lure Taiwan to the PRC. It was only after the Taiwanese rejected this on multiple occasions, and Deng was looking for a way to sell the reversion of Hong Kong that it was applied to Hong Kong. Taiwan saw that this would go bad, right? They knew where it would go. Hong Kong has convinced them they were correct. And from, not long after 97 on, Taiwan has been going, see, that's what would happen here. And in 2019, when they really cracked down, it convinced Taiwan that, there was long a perception in the West that Taiwan was unwilling to defend itself, right? They're Chinese, and if the PRC comes, they'll probably acquiesce. And there was some concern in Taiwan that the populace wasn't willing to fight either. 2019 convinced them they had to fight. And the willingness of people to defend themselves on public opinion polls just started going up exponentially. Coming finally back to Ukraine convinced the Taiwanese that they could, right? That we actually have a chance to win this because, the plucky Ukrainians, sometimes using asymmetric methods, but they wanted to fight and defend themselves. They managed to hold off the Russian onslaught and then push it back. And so from a Taiwanese perspective, Ukraine showed them that, yes, we have to fight, and we could probably win this thing. Well, maybe win this thing. We're willing to try to win this thing at the very least, right? And so for Taiwan, I think that's the effect of Ukraine. To Xi Jinping, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, saw that, this could not be as easy as some might think. And I personally think they already knew it was a hard problem, but they saw additionally how irregular fighters could really give them a hard time, even if they could defeat conventional forces. So there's been a lot of gum gnashing in the People's Liberation Army. Okay, what are the Russians doing wrong? How does that affect us? And even though you've seen now an increase in naval and air sorties in an attempt to appear to surround Taiwan, there's not an attempt to take it. They're trying to send a message about what it actually is and how they own it, rather than take it by force, which they don't think they can do right now.
So I'm going to put one more question to the panel, and I'll ask each of you to respond. If you guys want to line up to take the mic and ask your questions, I invite you to do that, and we'll incorporate questions from the live audience online as well. So we'll come to you in just a moment. Let me ask each of you this question. So I've been thinking about the way Putin has become very prominent. You've characterized him as an authoritarian leader. Maybe even he's on the verge of being characterized as a dictator. We have Xi Jinping very aggressively starting the world. They collaborate. They have a relationship. And I think there are other authoritarian figures that are also becoming more salient in Europe. And I'm interested in your perspective on whether it's a formal collaboration or a commonality of interests. How do you understand that trend? Which I think, first, do you agree that that is a trend, and how do you understand it? So maybe we'll start with you, Yaron.
I mean, I think they're collaborating to the extent that they view themselves as having a common enemy, the enemy is civilization and the West. They hate each other's guts. They don't really get along. They have massive conflicts. China has a claim against land in eastern Russia and would love to get their hands on that. They don't like each other. There's conflicts around energy, and the Russians would like Chinese explicit support militarily on a much larger scale than they're getting it. The Chinese don't want it because they don't want to offend the West too much because they're worried about economic repercussions. So, you know, it's like Russia and Iran have this relationship. But Russia has a real Islamist problem. You know, Islamic totalitarianism, we saw the terrorist attack in Russia recently. They've got a number of sections of Russia that are very Islamist, and they're worried about them. So any cooperation with Iran, you know, on the one hand, they need the Iranians. In a weird kind of context, the Iranians make drones better than the Russians. But on the other hand, they're afraid of the Iranians, and they're afraid of the Iranian influence on the Islamic totalitarians within their realm. But this is what happens. This is Stalin and Hitler. You know, yes, they can get along for a little while, but in the end, they're going to go after each other's throats because the only way they know how to deal with each other is through violence. That's, at the end of the day, that's their tool, and that's the mechanism. But, you know, they have a common enemy right now. They're going to work together up to a point around that common enemy. They sense a weakness in the West. Mm-hmm. They definitely sense that the West is morally weak. And you can see that vis-a-vis Israel, and you can see that certainly in Ukraine. And they're going to try to exploit that, each one to elevate their own interests. But at the end of the day, there are going to be conflicts between them as well.
Peter or Scott?
Well, Yaron said it very well. I don't have anything more to add to it.
Okay.
I think that's exactly true. They see it. They see the West, or particularly the United States, as an enemy of all of them, and they're willing to cooperate in the same way that criminals will often cooperate, even though they have differences among them. They see the United States and the West as the fundamental barrier to their imperialist objectives, and that's why they're allying to mount a joint defense or joint attack against the West, regardless of their trivial differences.
I wouldn't go so far as to say a joint attack. They're using each other, I would say. And for example, you know, the PRC keeps trickling out non-military support to Russia. Why? Because Russia in a quagmire in the Ukraine helps them, especially if the West keeps feeding stuff in. It weakens both sides. They're both using each other and getting what they can. PRC happens to be in a bit of a stronger position right now, but Russia's getting what they can as well.
Okay. We're going to take questions. We'll start with the mic, and let's try something different this time. This is mainly for you guys. Let's try to get brief responses, and maybe we can jump around a bit and get through as many questions as we can, and then we can circle back, and if there's more to discuss, all right? Let's start with you. Yes?
Is the only justified interest America has in foreign policy in protecting American citizens from existential threats? The example I would, posit is if the Byzantine and Ottoman Empire were fighting today in the middle of Turkey, would we have anything to say about it?
No, can I take that? You have to have a clear definition of what your interest is so that you can define when and for what reason you would engage in military action as self-defense. And the one thing is the defense of the freedom, the rights of your citizens. That's it. That's what we're here for. And when those rights are threatened, then you have to act aggressively. When those rights aren't threatened, you don't take any action. So there are many things that will happen in the rest of the world that are not of any interest to us necessarily, that have no effect on us, and then you just abstain from doing anything. But when there is a clear threat, which too often exists and we ignore and are ignoring at our expense, then you have to take action.
Okay. Yes.
So a theme in this conference is the sanction of the victim. So my question is how the United Nations, and particularly how Israel and U.S. involvement in the United Nations kind of represents the sanction of the victim.
God. Ayn Rand wrote about this decades ago. Ayn Rand wrote about this. I mean, the United Nations is one of the most, if not the most corrupt, organizations ever created. And if you think about its corruption today, think about it at its founding. At its founding, America and the Soviet Union sat at a table as equal partners, equal veto rights, and anybody was admitted, whether they were dictatorships or horrific genocidal regimes. It didn't matter who the regime was, as long as they were a country, they were admitted into the United Nations. And, with the exception of Security Council, everybody gets a vote, and then the Security Council has a special vote. And then at some point, because I guess bad guys weren't represented enough on the Security Council, they brought Mao Zedong in. They brought the Chinese in as well to kind of balance it out. It's in every respect. I mean, the anecdotes are absurd, right? Iran running the Human Rights Commission, and you can go on and on and on. It is a massive sanction of the victim. The victim here are the West. The victim is any. And when I talk about the West, I talk about free countries, right? So I include, in my view, Japan and South Korea and Taiwan are part of the West. Maybe in some respects even better, right? But they are part of the West. It's a huge sanction of the victim of any free country to participate in this, and for Israel to participate, for Israel to suffer the blows and say, "Oh, we object" or whatever, but to sanction the organization, and to sanction the voting, and to sanction everything like that, or even make proposals of their own, is absurd. And that's true of the ICC and the ICJ and really any international organization, even the WHO that includes both dictatorial regimes and free countries, and they're all treated as the same. Every single one of those organizations need to be dismantled, or completely reformed, or completely rethought.
My question is for Scott McDonald. You discussed a lot about China and Taiwan and the Chinese relationship to Taiwan. And according to Mao, I know he said famously in quotations that political power flows from the barrel of a gun. Of course, the revisionist Deng Xiaoping came along and said, no, we can use the capital mode of production as an instrument to develop the productive forces of China, and the contradictions inherent to the capital mode of production will lead to its own destruction. So with the shift in ideology that China took, is the reason China has not launched a land invasion over Taiwan because of this shift in Chinese ideology? And if Maoism had continued to take its form in China, what would the approach China would have in foreign policy related to Taiwan be?
Okay, thanks. Bit to unpack there, and in fairness, I think you put a few words in Deng's mouth. But Deng, on the fundamentals, does not disagree with Mao, right? The purpose of the Chinese Communist Party is to continue to lead as the Chinese Communist Party, because they are the only ones who can do it, according to them, right? This country, nobody else can do it. It's got to be us. We know best. Okay, Mao and Deng did have some disagreements at any particular time of what was best to do it. Mao was very concerned at the end of his life that people who were using some technocratic means were gaining more power. That's why he stormed back in the Cultural Revolution, right? It wasn't even the economic tools. It's the fact that my power and my revolution is being undermined, okay? So Deng does not disagree that power ultimately flows from the barrel of a gun and that the party must maintain power at all costs, right? Even during the early reform period, he goes back to the 4 cardinal principles over and over again. I'll summarize the 4 cardinal principles in the first one. The CCP is in charge, right? And over again. His use of economic liberalization was no more than a tool to get the country to where he thought it needed to be. And I think that to separate him out from other henchmen is probably kinder to him than we need to be.
And just as a reminder, it was Deng who ordered the tanks into Tiananmen Square. It was Deng that ordered the firing on the students, tens of thousands of lives, maybe, we don't really know,
Right.
taken. That was Deng. You know, at the same time he's reforming the economy, he's willing to shoot and kill as many people as necessary to maintain power. There was nothing else. So he is at the end of the day, he's an evil character in spite of the economic reforms that did a lot for the Chinese people and the rest of the world.
Interesting. I'd like to follow up, but we'll keep
Just go to the back of the line. You can ask another question.
We're going to go quick.
We have a question from Marley Aline. Question for any or all the speakers. What do you read, watch, listen to keep informed on what's happening in the world?
Well, you know,
Yaron answered this in detail a couple of days ago. But,
Yes, I did.
You know, I am a little bit different. I try to read some of the news coming out of the PRC to see what they're saying about what they're doing, just because that's what I spend my time on. But I agree, scan broadly. It's funny, I've heard a few times this conference, such and such is not being covered by the mainstream media. I read about those every day in the mainstream media. It kind of depends on where you look, right? Because I'm always looking for the China stuff. So what's important, set up a broad scan and then cross-check.
Yeah. There is no one source. If you think you're going to find one source that is going to give you the truth, or if you're gravitating towards watching only one channel or one newspaper, you're doing it wrong. You know, they're all flawed in significant ways. The only way to get a grasp of it is to scan a bunch of sources, and then when before you commit to anything, cross-reference and check the original. You know, go find the video with the quote, and if you have the time and it's important enough to you, but there's so much distortion out there. It's hard to really imagine.
You could also just watch YBS.
You could just watch my show, yes.
Okay. Let's go back to the questions in the room.
Yeah, there was an article I think it was the National Interest. They said that even aircraft carriers, they'd be too endangered to use in the Taiwan Strait. We got to withdraw them back and just use submarines. I can't believe that. They're threatened by the Chinese weapons and the North Koreans and the Russians. It doesn't make sense at all.
Let me tell you what they're doing. They're failing to understand the adversary, right? I mean,
yes.
We're objectivists, right? We're supposed to
Yes.
take the time to understand the real world, apply logical thought to it. We have a lot of people looking at the PRC through the lens of fear, right? And so without trying to understand who they are and how they make decisions. And so they design the DF-21 Delta, that's the anti-ship ballistic missile, and we draw a line on a map and we say, that line can't be crossed. Whose fault is that? Right? That's our fault, because we're not taking the time to understand the situation. What are they building it for? How are they going to use it? And what are the actual capabilities? And we get afraid to sail an aircraft carrier when the actual situation is much more complex. So.
Would the old Iowa battleships be of help? I have no idea. I write an article saying I don't know whether they would, and people all
As
claim to be
beautiful as they are,
experts, they come right down on me. We can never, ever bring them back.
as beautiful as a broadside is from an Iowa-class battleship, they have been exceeded by modern technology.
Okay.
So.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was listening the other day on the flagship neoconservative podcast, and they were strapping on their boots to go and fight in Taiwan. And I remember something, I think, Yaron, you said many years ago, you said something like, a good rule of thumb on whether to send American soldiers somewhere is whether you would send your son. So my question to you is, and to everyone in the panel, where would you draw the line on where you'd send your son? Taiwan, Ukraine, NATO country, further towards the ocean, UK? What is the point at which we say, okay, now we send our army to fight and...
All right. First, I think that's the wrong question to ask. The question that you should be asking is not what should we do if China invades Taiwan or whatever. What the question is, what should we do to prevent that from happening? What do we have to do to make sure that doesn't happen? Because we've been inviting those things. And what have we done to invite them? By demonstrating to the world that we are not willing to defend our interests, we're not willing to do what's necessary to protect our freedom. The most recently disastrous example of that was Afghanistan, where we spent 20 years and people, thousands of Americans were killed, billions and trillions of dollars were spent, with the end result being zero positive accomplished, because the Taliban, the same government that was in charge at the beginning is in charge at the end. The same kind of Islamic totalitarianism is imposed on Afghanistan as before, and the same kind of threat, potential threat to us exists as before. When bin Laden led Al-Qaeda and they attacked the US on 9/11, he said explicitly, he cited many of the examples of the cases where America was defeated because it was unwilling to fight back. He cited Vietnam. I think he cited other examples. Beirut, from Lebanon, the Marines killed in Lebanon. So the question is, what do we need to do to prevent these attacks? And we need to show that we're willing to use force in our defense. And I'll give you a very simple solution. Here's what we could do in 24 hours to prevent an attack. It won't happen, but if I was president, here's what we do. You issue notice to Iran. You say, we now know that you are on the verge of being capable of creating nuclear bombs. We know where you're producing them. You have 24 hours to dismantle that facility, or we will dismantle it for you. And when they don't dismantle it, you send the bombs to destroy it. Very simple, not that hard. We know where they are, and we have the military capability to do it. If you do that, there's nothing more convincing to these potential enemies, these potential dictators who want to take action against us, that we will retaliate. Now, it's possible that doing it once may not be enough. You may have to do it twice just so people believe it's not an aberration. But if you did it twice, we would be safe for decades.
Can I... So I want to pick up on what Nikos was asking, because I remember that talk you gave where you gave that example. It's a very powerful heuristic. Where would you be willing to see your child go to fight? So maybe you could just revive the context for what you were trying to capture with that thought at the time, and how it integrates with what Peter's saying.
Well, I think the main thing I'm trying to capture with that is the seriousness of going to war. Right? Going to war is serious, and people can talk about it abstractly. And other kids, other people's children are going off to war, and whether it's a just war, an unjust war, a correct war, an incorrect war, and then we tie their hands behind their backs and we put blindfolds on them as they fight in Iraq, and kids are dying, and there's a certain uncaring in the population about that, and a lack of focus on what is our self-interest. And of course, when it's your kid, at least if you're healthy, then you're concerned about self-interest. So is it truly in our self-interest to go fight this war? And if it is, if it's my kid, how do I want the war to be fought? I want everything to be done to win quickly, thoroughly, with minimal casualties on my side. That is my kids. I want them, as few of them as possible today. And I think for every conflict, one has to, it's about when to go to war and how to go to war. You know, right now, if you asked me, should the United States go to war in X? And the answer is almost always going to be today, no. And only because it's likely to be a complete failure. Complete failure, right? So there's a completely different, you know, should we go to war to win? That's one. But if we're going to go to war to lose, then don't go to war. So in the current situation, we can't go to war to win. So, you know, it's horrible, the world in which we live, because there's no good outcome that's possible given the world in which we live. Now, what we should advocate for is, in some circumstances, go to war, but go to war this way. And if you're not willing to do this, then stay home. But then accept the fact that by staying home, you're sacrificing and you're going to be worse off.
I'd like to...
Could I add something to that?
Can I just jump in on that, and I'll bring you into... I'm very passionate about this topic because I have a son, and I study foreign policy, and I've thought about this for a long time. But I wanted to bring up an aspect from your comment that I think is worth distinguishing or putting more in focus, which is a lot of the commentary and analysis that's done in the foreign policy world and establishment sort of perspective on this. And you said the prompt for this, you were listening to a neoconservative podcast, and they were all ready to boots on the ground. Notice it's boots on the ground. It's not even people. It's sort of this metaphorical, it's depersonalized. And one of the things I've noticed in the last 20 years thinking about this is just how collectivized and altruistic and how those two integrate the thinking is. It's not my neighbor's son is shipping out to Iraq and he might be blown up by an ID. It's we're sending boots on the ground. No, you're not. You're sending American teenagers. And their lives are irreplaceable. And when you and that perspective is just so embedded. The idea that not we, but the foreign policy makers and the political leaders and the people in the decision process they have to make these decisions about where to deploy. But morally speaking, if the thinking is influenced by altruism and collectivism, it's going to be very bad, and it causes the kind of tragedies we're seeing, because your willingness to dispose of other people's lives, there's a corruption in that. That is very much what we saw in the Soviet Union on a really concentrated scale. It's what you see in China. And that's statist, it's manifested politically in statism. During Vietnam, we saw the draft. That's precisely the form that it takes. And to me, that's one of the greatest evils that we see manifesting in the way people think about this. So to your question of where, my answer to that is you gave very sophisticated aspects. My answer to that is, to the extent that I can, I'm going to prevent my son from becoming involved in any of the military branches. For the reason that you raised, Yaron, which is I have so little confidence that any of these decisions will be the right ones, that I would not want to see my son or anybody's child, son or daughter, deployed in pursuit of policies that are really detrimental to America's interests, and therefore subverting the value of their lives. To me, that's the point I wanted to raise. But Peter, I cut you off, so I apologize, and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with what Elan and Yaron said, but something needs to be added. Let's assume that we had a proper military strategy so that when we engage in military action, we're going to do it properly, and we're going to do it to achieve victory, and we know how. There is a range of military activities that can be engaged in depending on circumstances. the most extreme manifestation of military action is sending actual US troops to fight and potentially die, and that is justified only when there is a real direct threat to America's safety. And I think, for example, Afghanistan was a good example of that. The Taliban attacked us. This whole phenomenon of Islamic totalitarianism is a clear objective danger to us. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were major forces in leading and activating this threat to us, so they needed to be militarily eliminated. So I think you could certainly justify sending American troops there, again, with the proviso that you do it properly, which they obviously didn't. But that doesn't mean that every single situation that may call for some kind of military action justifies sending American troops. So, for example, Ukraine. I don't think you could justify sending American troops there, but you could justify sending military equipment to Ukraine. You could justify providing them with information, with military intelligence, because they are fighting a potential enemy of ours, Russia. Russia is not directly posing a threat to us now, so I don't think we should go to war with Russia, but it's perfectly justifiable to send arms to them, to Ukraine. And one last point. Even when it comes to something like fighting the Taliban, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, that too is in some way unjustified, because the proper action that America should have taken is to destroy the mainspring of Islamic totalitarianism, which is Iran. So if we took proper action against Iran, you wouldn't have the situation with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan or elsewhere in the world. So even there it's misguided. So a proper foreign policy is identify your enemy, identify the fact that they're posing a threat to you, to the freedom of your citizens, and then take all action necessary to annihilate that threat without regard for all of these altruistic concerns about how many people are going to be hurt, what about civilian casualties. Any harm that's done in the process of a proper defense of your rights, of America's rights, of a free country, any harm that comes even as an unintended consequence is 100% the responsibility, the moral responsibility of the initiator of that threat, not of the retaliator.
I had asked everyone to give brief responses, then I jumped in. Okay, let's come back to you.
So since the Russia-Ukraine situation, I've been trying to grapple with like corner cases or less center of the page cases of American interests. Like it's not obvious to me, yes or no. And the question isn't about Ukraine, but it's not obvious to me. I could see a case for, yes, America has a direct national security interest in securing Ukraine, and I can see a case for no. So I have a question that's sort of another case that I've been thinking about. If there were some country that's like a major economic partner, like trading partner, many American companies trade with these companies, not national security companies, but like lots of active trade, lots of wealth going back and forth, et cetera, and that country were attacked or like internally taken over by a coup or something like that, on the grounds of protecting the Americans' rights to trade with them, might it be proper to militarily intervene even if there were no physical threat to Americans?
I would say no, because if they're here, right, the U.S. government should be doing all they can to protect their rights, right? You can even make a case for on the high seas. When you set up a company in a foreign country, you understand you're taking a certain risk, right? And so the sending our lives and treasure abroad because some other country has gone basket case, and the people who took a risk there might have their property, seized in that country, I think does not rise to the level of us going in and fighting a war. There's
Because I do.
Yeah, I think that there's a certain level of expectation when you go overseas that you are in that country.
I think you need to qualify that. That's true, but you need to qualify that. If you set up a company in a country that is, a dictatorship, or that is clearly an enemy of the United States, then you cannot expect the United States to defend you. So if somebody were to, if you set up today, you went to Afghanistan to set up a business and they confiscated it, the American government has no obligation to protect you. But there are many times where it's perfectly reasonable to engage in economic activity, and then some government entity acts and takes it over. You have a right to do, you have an obligation to protect, let's put it this way. The American government has an obligation to protect its citizens from harm. I think that extends beyond our borders. So if you're on a ship in the Atlantic Ocean, you're on a cruise in the Mediterranean, and some pirates attack you, the American government has a right and an obligation to protect you, to use force to retrieve the ship and kill the pirates. If it's a government that is doing the attacking, all the more so. That's in effect an act of war. Part of the proper functions of a legitimate State Department in a free country is to identify to your citizens and to the world which countries you regard as enemies. And I think the State Department should have a list. These are the countries we regard as hostile to the United States. People travel there at their own risk. And if people go there, okay, but we're not going to defend you. If you go to a civilized country and you're, let's say, what would be a good example?
France.
Well, France, yeah, I mean, Western Europe.
Semi-civilized.
The recent attacks by these Houthis in Yemen in the Red Sea, right? So you have shipping lanes. You know the geography better than I do. You have shipping lanes in the Red Sea, which are used all the time by American ships and others. And these primitive two-bit Houthis who barely have weapons above handguns are attacking ships that are going through there, including American ships, then certainly the government should go there and in 10 minutes wipe them out. There's no question about that, and we don't even do that. We took some action, and we took half-assed action against them. But the point is, let the people know which countries are enemies of the U.S., which aren't. And when I say enemies, that means we're having nothing to do with them. If you go there, it's at your own risk. But if you go to a country that is not so designated, then I think the government has an obligation to protect you.
Yeah, I just want to amplify that, because this is something that I'm really interested in, and I think it's really useful to think about this. So the point I want to amplify from what I'm hearing from you, Peter, is when we think about these cases now, it's very much colored by the absence of coherent foreign policy. And so I think your reaction completely, yeah, I get it. Like, you're in Venezuela and you're surprised your oil facility is being nationalized. Okay, that's not surprising. But it's useful to take your point and put it in the positive frame is there is a positive that foreign policy should be providing, but it isn't. And when we put it in that framework, it's guiding. And if it's really principled, it's powerfully guiding. And so there would be constantly updating knowledge about different countries and constantly updated analysis of the risk and the friendship and the nature of their alliance. And there's a lot of gradations between, say, our relationship today with the United Kingdom versus our relationship today with Saudi Arabia, which is very corrupt, but they're both seen as allies. And so, but in the world, there would always be those gradations of what countries are like, and you would need to be thinking about that. So that's one aspect that I wanted to amplify. And the other one is just the power of a principled foreign policy. And I give talks about this often, and it's interesting how people don't have that concept. It's like it's a floating idea. Like, what do you mean principled foreign policy? There's always trade-offs. There's always this. There's always that. But there's real value in conceptualizing what that looks like. And I think this goes to the issue of sanction, moral sanction, and that's really part of what you're raising, right? So the function of the government is to assess other countries, and in effect, what it's saying is, we're giving a moral sanction to the United Kingdom, we're withdrawing it from the Taliban. We're not going to send a diplomatic envoy to Afghanistan, we are to France. Yes. And that's the moral issue that I think of as, it's not even on the table. Like the idea that this would be a discriminator, it has to be discriminating, right? It has to be discriminating from a moral perspective. So the kind of cases you're raising, they're always going to be challenging, but they would be easier to do in a positive framework. So
we have to get rid of all the diplomats in the State Department.
Yeah, but I think those are really good questions to think about because they illustrate both where things are going wrong today and to get outside that context and to think about there's a necessary and important function that isn't being served, but were it being served, there would be so much better guidance for businesses that they wouldn't have to take the kind of risks that they basically are now. Yeah, thank you. Do we have a question from the back?
No. Yes, we have a question from Scott. Does the idea that the enemy of my enemy is my friend work for an objectivist inspiring foreign policy?
No. No, I mean, it depends. Of course, the enemy of my enemy could be my friend. That doesn't exclude that, but an assumption that the enemy of my enemy are bad guys, but they just in this particular circumstances happen to be against my enemy, that always backfires. It's always backfired in history, and it's almost never necessary, particularly again. I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is the context of the United States, and that's an important context. The United States has the mightiest military force in all of human history. And we don't need enemies of our enemies in order to fight the bad guys. We just need to assert ourselves, define what our self-interest is, and execute on that. And in that context, and we have enough friends who are free, that is good countries. So that's great. So alliances of free countries are a good thing. But there's never any reason to ally yourself with evil in a fight against another evil.
You ultimately end up undermining your own position.
I just want to add one quick thing on that. So to me, that's a wonderful illustration of how it's important to be suspicious of conventional proverbs and sort of sayings and catchphrases. To think about how many of you have read Ayn Rand's essay, Philosophy, Who Needs It? And in there, she makes the point, a lot of the way people hold philosophy is in terms of these catchphrases or bywords, and this is one of them. I mean, it's not a principle, because as you were just explaining, sometimes it applies, sometimes it doesn't apply, but be suspicious of things like that and try to unpack them to understand what would it look like to have a principle of deciding whom to ally with and whom not, and that certainly doesn't do it, but there is a need for that kind of conceptualization. So I think that's just a powerful example of it. Let's come back to you.
Gentlemen, thank you for your ringingly clear principle moral statements. Really appreciate that. Is there any hope for Ukraine?
I think so. I think the hope for Ukraine is what I view as the weakness of Russia. Now, you know, the real enemy of Ukraine right now, in many respects, is not Russia, but it's the West. It's the West's the efforts that the West is going to engage in, and forcing them to the negotiating table, to compromise, to achieve some kind of deal. But if we just give them the weapons, which we're doing a little bit of, not as, and we leave them alone, I think the ultimate outcome is Ukraine beats Russia. That is, drives them out of Ukraine. But I don't know that that's going to happen. We seem to give them a little bit of weapons and then withdraw, and we certainly are not giving them the full moral sanction that they deserve, that will allow them to do it. We're constantly constraining them, constantly holding them back. I mean, you can fire missiles, but not too far. Okay, so now Biden said you can fire missiles into Russia in a particular province, so far from the border, but not in other provinces, and not further than 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers from the border. I mean, it's just absurd. So just like, but it's not surprising, right? When our troops were in Baghdad, they were told you could only fire under certain circumstances, not too far. Don't fire it when you're not convinced that no civilians will be hurt. So we constrained our own forces even more than we're constraining the Ukrainians. Of course, we're going to constrain the Ukrainians. So is the hope? So is there hope? Probably not. But it's going. If there isn't, it's all our fault.
Peter, do you agree?
Yes. The question is entirely, the entire question rests on what the West is willing to do. Because if the West were willing, particularly the US, were willing to provide Ukraine with all the weapons it could use, yes, then it would clearly defeat Russia. But that's the issue. Is the West willing to do that? Is it willing to take a principled stand and say, whatever you need, we're going to give you. Need for what? Whatever you need in order to actually defeat the enemy, to drive them out. Now, they don't even want to take over Russia. They just want to drive them out of Ukraine. So if the West were willing to do that, yes, no question they could do it. But Russia is there waiting us out, knowing that we're half interested and half committed and half uncommitted to doing it. Maybe they're going to wait for Trump to be president, and pretty sure Trump will not do even as much as Biden is doing. So it all hinges on that. It hinges on, is the West willing to give Ukraine the weapons necessary to defeat Russia?
Thank you.
Why do you think there are so many supporters of Hamas and Palestine, and why are they so vocal and aggressive about it, and how does that apply to foreign policy?
Thank you.
Well, I wrote an article about that. I mentioned it a little bit at the beginning. The Hamas draws sympathy because they are seen as the needier entity. Israel is strong, Hamas is weak. Israel is winning, Hamas is losing. It doesn't matter why they're weak, it doesn't matter why they're losing, it doesn't matter why they're suffering. The cause is irrelevant, and the cause is Hamas itself. All that matters, according to the ethics of altruism, is if someone is suffering, you're obligated to sacrifice for them. Are they the cause of their own suffering? Doesn't matter. You are obligated to help them. You must sacrifice your interests for them. That is why Hamas is drawing such sympathy. So altruism means always, ultimately, it's the sacrifice of something good for something bad. It's a sacrifice of the just to the unjust. It's not just the rich to the poor, but it's the sacrifice of the right to the wrong, because that's a sacrifice. If the right triumphs over the wrong, that's not a sacrifice, that's justice. And justice is contrary to altruism. So the sympathy and the support that Hamas draws is entirely at root due to the dominant influence of altruism.
I mean, I'll just add to that what has happened at the universities over the last few decades is they have become more committed to consistent application of altruism. So the whole culture is altruistic. But many people hold it a mishmash. They hold parts of it. They're not willing to completely commit to altruism all the way. But on our universities, the professors teaching in the name of a variety of different ideologies in modern times, they are now committed to this idea of altruism. And not only is it that they don't believe the Palestinians caused their own poverty and their own weakness, but the ideology is now that because we're all determined by factors that are not in our control, this whole identitarian movement on the academic left, that the only explanation for the fact that the Palestinians are suffering, the only possible explanation is that they were oppressed by the Israelis. That is, it cannot be their fault. It can only be that the Israelis are oppressing them. So everything is now viewed, all human relations really, beyond even foreign policy, all human relations are now conceived of in terms of oppressor and oppressed. Who is who? And your sympathy, because of altruism, is always with that of the oppressed. And therefore, because the other, the successful, the rich, the happy, is by definition the oppressor, you always hate them for being an oppressor. Right? So it's just so much, the reason there's passion is they're so consistent in the application of their altruism.
Can I ask a follow-up on that, just to build on the question? So how do you think of that in the context of the hatred aspect of it? So you said it's sympathy for the Palestinians. Is it a reaction? It's not a reaction to a positive, that there's some value there. How much of it is, well, Israel is successful, and that's suspicious, and that's so. How do you integrate that with sort of what I see as a nihilistic thread that runs through this? Yeah.
Go ahead.
I mean, there's a nihilism. There's definitely a nihilistic, and altruism, when taken to its extreme, has to become nihilistic. There's no other outcome because nihilism leads to nothing but death. Who sacrifices to whom? I mean, who's the end beneficiary of the sacrifices? So it leads to that. It's a particular form of altruism, of collectivism, which is egalitarianism, which is a particular vicious form of this, which is nihilistic. But look, why do people hate the rich in America? Put aside, they hate the rich in America because well, if you're rich, you should be sacrificing to the poor. You should be giving them all your money, and yet you're not. So you're being immoral by not providing with them, and so you must be selfish. You must be doing self-interested things, and that's morally offensive, and that's morally absurd. And the same thing about Israel. Israel's strong, Israel's rich, Israel's successful. Oh, well, they must be evil because they are being selfish, self-interested, and they're not sacrificing themselves to the Palestinians.
We have another question.
Okay.
What do you think about the arguments that there's some culpability of NATO and by extension the US as its chief backer in what some people would call quote-unquote provoking Russia to attack Ukraine? I have heard people saying that the West isn't necessarily innocent because it backed the color revolutions and the Maidan, or that it didn't want Russia to join NATO in the 90s when Russia wasn't a threat to other countries.
A brief response to that?
Yeah, that's absurd. That's just... that's saying the rich provoke attacks on them by being rich. The successful provoke attack by being successful. The existence of NATO is as a self-defense organization to retaliate against aggression. So is the victim responsible because you were there, you allowed yourself to be attacked? If you weren't there, there wouldn't be any aggression. That's what that amounts to. NATO did not attack Russia. NATO is there in order to defend against an objective threat from authoritarian entities like Russia. So if the aggressive threat were not there, there would be no NATO.
And I'll just add to that. Note that it also denies the Ukrainians any agency and sovereignty. Like, Ukraine can't decide if they want to join Russia or not. join NATO or not. So they chose to join NATO. That is somehow a threat. And as Peter said, of course it's not a threat. The whole point of NATO is self-defense. It is blaming the victim here, and it really is an absurdity to blame NATO for this when the clear aggressor and the clear evil here. And we have to, Russia under this regime is an evil country, and we have to declare it as such. And it comes from a place of not being willing to morally judge, and we have to morally judge. Otherwise, you cannot have foreign policy without the ability to morally judge.
I've written on this subject, so for the person who asked the question, if you want, I have comments on this. It's in New Ideal, came out a couple of years ago. It's in response to John Mearsheimer, which you probably recognize the name as someone in the field who makes this argument, who made it very popular since the Ukraine invasion. So just as a reference for someone interested in that.
But John Mearsheimer too, right? He has abstracted away from ideas and people, right? It's just billiard ball bouncing around. So by not looking at what's actually going on, by not looking at the humans and making moral judgments, it leads to that kind of thing. And sorry, I cut you off?
This is exactly the same argument libertarians use to attack America. There's a big body of opinion which is promoted by libertarians largely, that America is responsible for 9/11. We invited the attack. We are the evil force in the world, and the Arab nations feel threatened by us, so we are responsible for getting them to attack us, and if only we withdrew all our activities from the rest of the world, then nothing like this would happen. And that's the same kind of senseless attack or senseless accusation as the one about Ukraine being responsible somehow, or NATO somehow being responsible for the attack by Russia.
I mean, you could argue that the sense in which NATO is responsible is they didn't accept Ukraine into NATO much earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there you go.
I mean, if they'd accepted Ukraine into NATO much earlier, there wouldn't have been an attack.
There you go.
Okay, there's a long line. I want to try to get as many of these questions in, so give us your question and then we'll try to respond briefly. Yes?
So I'll very quickly explain the angle I'm coming from. So the sort of sovereignty that Hong Kong had for as long as it did, it was what I call a faith-based sovereignty. It is not independently defended, not that we can. And the only reason it existed for as long as it did is that there were economic/financial interests in Beijing for a free port. So when Beijing stops valuing that and favors nationalistic interests, well, that sums up 2019. And much of the much of this also applies to the non-American West, where we are under-defended because we believe that there were American interests in our countries. And, when that American interest is gone for God knows why, we're screwed. So the question is, how should a country like, say, the UK approach militarization when, everybody has something to be protected by a functional military, but most people refuse to recognize that fact and would not consent to, say, military spending or potentially a draft, especially when we are pressed on time?
Well, first of all, I would agree with you with Hong Kong, right? There was no sovereignty, right? Sovereignty belonged to the PRC. And if you actually read some of the discussions early on in that process of applying the idea to Hong Kong, it was very clear that from Deng's perspective, it was only going to have liberty as long as it was useful to the PRC. So I agree completely with you there. That's why I said the 50 years was kind of a phony number. But any country, right, needs to look at what its interests are and then look at its security environment and determine what level of military spending it needs to secure itself. And it's going to vary by country. However, you said one thing that I wanted to call out. You said the need for the draft, right? Wholeheartedly reject that any country should be having the draft, right? You don't defend liberty by forcing people to serve who don't want to serve.
So. What's about military spending?
Maybe you didn't mean that, but that's what I heard. And I wanted to put a marker on the ground there, right? I served in the military voluntarily, and I don't think anybody should do it under coercion. Otherwise, what you're defending is not a free state.
Okay. Yeah, what about military spending?
You have to judge your security environment, right? There is no, this is the number. It depends on what your country is, what are the interests, what are the actual threats to it, and then you should spend some money to defend yourself at the appropriate level. It is one of the legitimate functions of government, and every country has to make that decision based on their own situation, though.
So despite the mass populace being against it.
So obviously, if no one in a country is willing to defend it, is willing to spend money to defend it, if no one in the country is willing to volunteer for military service, that country's time is numbered, right? And probably will go away at some point. And that there are deeper philosophical problems in a populace there, right? If they've decided that it is not worth defending our freedom. Now, if it's a tyrannical country and the people are against it, yay, right? And hopefully it will collapse. So
wouldn't that be massively unjust on the small minorities who are actually willing to defend the country?
I think that's difficult to answer.
Yeah.
We would need more context for that. But if you want to follow up with that, there's more aspects I think we need to unpack. But I think we're going to have time for maybe one, possibly two questions. So for those of you still in line, I just want to give you a fair warning.
Hi, this is directed to the gentleman who talked about China. There's a growing talk about a theory about China attacking Taiwan that I think deserves some skepticism, but it's growing nevertheless. And that reasoning goes that like this, that Taiwan Semiconductor is such a huge part of the whole economy of the world, let alone Taiwan and therefore China, that the PRC would be hesitant to broach an attack on Taiwan. It would be shooting itself badly enough. So I wonder if you've thought about this issue.
So, I see where you're going with that. So I personally don't think the PRC is about to attack Taiwan because it is damaging to them, though not the semiconductors in and of itself. They're on record, and I would take them at their word that we would not be restrained by economic damage should we decide to attack Taiwan.
They've said that?
They have said that explicitly on multiple occasions. However, what they will be restrained by is the potential for any attack on Taiwan to cause the CCP to fall. Right? The purpose of the Chinese Communist Party is the maintenance of the reign of the Chinese Communist Party. Right? That is their animating principle. Right? And so an attack on Taiwan, which my military analysis tells me is more likely than not to fail, is a real threat to the People's Republic of China because it is a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And they are, you can argue about troop numbers and whether they'd have to or not. Of course, if Taiwan declares independence, then they might be pushed into a corner. But given the choice, Xi Jinping wants to take Taiwan, but he wants to do it peacefully.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
So my question's about military experts and foreign policy experts. Just some examples of where they've gone wrong recently and in the past. So historical assessments of the USSR's capabilities, assessment of Russia's capabilities in Ukraine and motivations for Ukraine, Ukraine's capabilities and ability and willingness to defend itself, Israel's surprise at being attacked by Hamas internally. Why do they keep getting things wrong?
I personally think it's a lack of objectivity, is what it comes down to, right? That manifests itself in several specific ways, but it takes constant mental effort to do good analysis. And let's be honest, there are a lot of people trying really hard to do good analysis on a daily basis in our intelligence community. But to understand a foreign power requires many things. And it's not just counting their bullets in airplanes. It's understanding the principles that motivate the leaders, right? What are the ideas that drive the actors? And a lot of our theories and policies, and we do it as shorthand, right? We talk about China will, Russia will, France will. Those entities don't actually do anything, right? It's the leaders of those that do things, and they have ideas that drive them. And I think we do two things. We forget that, and we start looking at them as these, abstract units that are just doing things, right? And then when we stop and think that they might have ideas, we tend to mirror image our own ideas, because that's easy. And we don't take the time to think about an alternative perspective. And in my own field, I see that all the time with people arguing, well, China will want X. Why? Well, because that's the right thing to do in their situation. Right? Well, according to whom? Right? According to you. And we have to be principled and follow a moral foreign policy. However, when we're looking at another state, we need to understand that their basis for making that decision might be different. And I think we fail on that a lot. So.
I mean, I'd say quickly two things. One is they don't understand motivation. You look at the Six-Day War in Israel and you see 10 Arab armies arrayed against this tiny little country. And why does one country, the Arab soldiers, as soon as they started shooting, they took off their boots and left them in the desert and they started running home. Why are they fighting? They have no incentive, no motivation. Same is happening right now with Ukraine. Russia amasses large numbers of troops. Why are they there? They're not motivated. They don't care about this. This is Putin's dream and the leadership's dream, and they're being slaughtered, and many of them don't want to be there, and they're trying to escape. So they have no conception of that, right? So again, it's not viewing the human being as a factor. And the second is they don't value the difference between freedom and non-freedom, right? Free countries are just better. They're better at pretty much everything. They're better at strategy. They're better at weapons. They're better at taking care of their own soldiers and equipping them. So, everybody was saying, oh my God, they're going to go into Rafah, they're going to go into Gaza, it's going to be Israel, people in a free country know what they're doing. They value their own troops. They're going to take the precautions. They're going to do it properly. And they still are not doing it properly the way we would conceive of it. And Hamas is what? It's nothing. And yet we estimate them highly because we can't make that differentiation between, I said at the beginning of the war, I fought against T-72s, and I know what T-72s are capable of. This is one of the Russian tanks. They're crap. They really are crap. And I don't think anybody, and the Russians build crappy weapons. And they always have. When they were Soviets, they always have. And people don't take that into account. They don't take into account the fact that a non-free country cannot produce anywhere close to the level of competence and ability and strategy and material well-being as a free country. And that goes back to the 70s when they thought the Soviet Union was growing faster than the US. The CIA's estimate was that the Soviet Union was going to become as rich as America, which was unbelievable fantasy. But it's not understanding, looking at some superficial number, not understanding how ideology drives these things.
If I can just rephrase what I'm hearing, what they're missing is the power that philosophy can give them to understand the fundamentals and to think more deeply about what should be done. And with that thought, I just took the last word. So I'm sorry about that. But thank you all for being here. Let me thank our panelists, Yaron Brook, Peter Schwartz, Scott McDonald.